Elijah Carter, a bright and kind-hearted 13-year-old, loved visiting his grandmother, Rose Carter, in the Willow Street neighborhood. The small, quiet area was filled with fond memories. Summer days playing on the porch, the smell of fresh cornbread wafting through the air, and the warm embrace of his grandmother's hugs. On this particular afternoon, Elijah was eager to see her. He had saved up his allowance to buy her a beautiful scarf, one he knew would bring a smile to her face. He tucked the small box into his jacket pocket and set off down the familiar streets. The autumn air was crisp, and the crunch of fallen leaves under his sneakers was a comforting sound. As he walked, he hummed a tune his grandmother used to sing to him when he was younger. The neighborhood was peaceful, with only the occasional car passing by or a dog barking in the distance. For Elijah, this place had always felt safe. But as he turned onto Willow Street, a creeping unease settled over him. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed two police officers walking behind him. At first, he paid no mind. After all, police patrolling the area was normal. But something about their posture, the way they walked with deliberate intent, made him uneasy. He stole a quick glance over his shoulder. Officers Reed and Caldwell were staring at him, their expressions unreadable but not welcoming. Elijah swallowed hard and looked straight ahead. Maybe he was overthinking, maybe they were just patrolling. But then their footsteps quickened. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. Something wasn't right. Elijah tried to shake off his nerves, reminding himself that he hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a kid walking to his grandmother's house. Still, he could feel their eyes on him. His pace quickened. The officers matched it. He wanted to believe it was a coincidence, but doubt gnawed at him. His father, Marcus Carter, was the newly appointed police chief in town, and he had always told Elijah, "If you ever feel unsafe, don't hesitate to call me." Elijah hesitated, then slipped his phone from his pocket. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed. At the precinct, Chief Carter was reviewing case files when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Elijah, his stomach tightened. "Hey buddy, what's up?" His voice was light, but concern flickered in his eyes. "Dad," Elijah whispered, "there are two officers following me. They're acting weird." Chief Carter sat up straight, his grip tightening on the phone. "Where are you?" "Willow Street, near Grandma's." "Stay calm, I'm on my way." The chief grabbed his keys and bolted out of his office. Meanwhile, Elijah kept walking, but the officers finally caught up to him. "Stop right there," Officer Reed commanded. Elijah froze. His pulse roared in his ears. "I'm just going to my grandmother's house," he said, his voice steady but careful. Officer Caldwell exchanged a glance with Reed before sneering. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Elijah frowned. I told you, my grandma lives here." Reed folded his arms. "You don't look like you belong." Elijah's stomach twisted. "I grew up here." The officers ignored him. "What's in your pockets?" Reed demanded. Elijah hesitated. "Nothing, just..." Before he could finish, Reed reached into his pocket and pulled out the small box. "What's this?" He shook it like it contained something suspicious. "It's a gift for my grandmother," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. Officer Caldwell hesitated, seeming unsure, but Reed's suspicion didn't waver. Elijah felt trapped. And then, the screech of tires tore through the tension. Chief Carter's car came to an abrupt stop. He stepped out, his face a mask of controlled fury. The officers turned, their postures stiffening. "Chief, sir," Caldwell stammered. "What is going on here?" Chief Carter's voice was low and commanding. Reed hesitated. "We thought he was acting suspicious." Chief Carter's jaw tightened. "Suspicious? This is my son." Caldwell's face turned pale. "You assumed he was a threat without asking a single question?" The chief continued. Silence. "Would you treat your own children this way?" Neither officer had an answer. Chief Carter's voice dropped to a deadly calm. "From now on, every person in this community will be treated with respect. Do I make myself clear?" Both officers nodded, guilt etched on their faces. Carter turned to Elijah, placing a firm but reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Let's go, son." As they walked away, Elijah felt a swell of pride. His father had stood up for him. But the problem wasn't over. It was just beginning. Elijah sat quietly in the passenger seat as Chief Carter drove toward his grandmother's house. The tension from the confrontation still clung to him like a heavy coat. His father hadn't spoken since they left the officers behind, but Elijah could feel the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Are you okay?" Chief Carter finally asked, his voice softer now. Elijah hesitated. "I don't know." His father sighed, gripping the wheel tighter. "I never wanted you to experience something like this." Elijah looked out the window. The neighborhood, once familiar and warm, now felt different, tainted. "I didn't do anything wrong," he murmured. "You didn't," Chief Carter assured him, "and that's the problem." They pulled up in front of Grandma Rose's house, where she stood on the porch, her hands clasped together. She had clearly seen everything unfold. "Elijah," she called, concern written all over her face. He got out of the car, and she wrapped him in a warm, protective hug. "Baby, are you all right?" Elijah nodded, but the lump in his throat remained. Chief Carter walked up the steps, his jaw still clenched. "Mama, we need to talk." Inside, the aroma of baked sweet potatoes filled the air, but Elijah wasn't in the mood to eat. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded to gaze. Chief Carter paced the room while Grandma Rose poured tea. She had seen her fair share of injustice over the years, but it never got easier. "What happened?" she asked. "Elijah was profiled," Chief Carter said flatly, "by my own officers." Grandma Rose shook her head. "Doesn't matter if you wear a badge or not, son, the world still sees him a certain way." Chief Carter exhaled sharply. "I know, but I won't let it slide." Elijah looked up. "What are you going to do?" His father met his gaze. "Hold them accountable." The next morning, Chief Carter walked into the precinct with purpose. His presence commanded attention, and every officer knew something was wrong. He called an emergency meeting, his gaze sweeping over the room until he landed on Officers Reed and Caldwell. "We need to talk about yesterday," he said, his voice even but firm. Caldwell shifted in his seat, guilt evident in his expression. Reed, however, sat stiffly, his face unreadable. Chief Carter folded his arms. "You racially profiled my son. You assumed he was a threat without any cause." "We were just doing our job," Reed said defensively. "Was he committing a crime?" "No, but then why did you stop him?" Silence. Chief Carter let the weight of his words settle over the room. "This department will not tolerate discrimination. There will be consequences." Caldwell looked down, regret in his eyes. Reed, however, remained unmoved. The battle for justice was only beginning. The precinct was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Chief Carter's words lingered in the air, waiting for a response. Officer Caldwell cleared his throat. "Chief," he hesitated. "I know we handled it wrong. I should have spoken up." Chief Carter nodded but remained firm. "You should have. And Reed?" Officer Reed's jaw tightened. "We were looking out for the neighborhood." Chief Carter's eyes darkened. "By harassing a 13-year-old boy?" Reed said nothing. The silence spoke volumes. The chief looked around the room, addressing the entire department. "Let me be clear. This department is supposed to serve and protect, not intimidate and humiliate. Racial profiling will not be tolerated." He let his words sink in before delivering his final decision. "Both of you are suspended, effective immediately, pending further review." A murmur swept through the room. Reed's face turned red, but he knew better than to argue. Caldwell simply nodded, accepting the consequences. Chief Carter turned and walked out, his blood still boiling. This was only the beginning. Elijah sat on his bed later that evening, replaying everything in his mind. His father had taken action, but the fear and humiliation still lingered. His phone buzzed. A message from his best friend, Malcolm. "Heard what happened. You good?" Elijah hesitated before typing, "I don't know." A second later, Malcolm replied, "Want to talk?" Elijah stared at the screen. Part of him did, but another part wasn't sure what to say. Instead, he just texted back, "Maybe later." He tossed his phone aside and lay back, staring at the ceiling. Everything felt different now. By the next morning, word had spread through Willow Street. Some were relieved that Chief Carter had taken action. Others were skeptical. At the local cafe, a heated debate was taking place. "It's about time someone in power did something," said Mr. Johnson, a retired teacher. "Too many of our kids go through this." "But suspending them?" Another man, Mr. Grady, scoffed. "They were just doing their job." "A job that includes harassing innocent kids?" Mrs. Alvarez interjected. "Would you be saying the same if it were your son?" The conversation continued, but one thing was clear. Change was coming, whether people liked it or not. When Elijah walked into school, the whispers started immediately. "Did you hear what happened to Elijah? His dad suspended 2 cops. Man, that's crazy. He kept his head down, trying to ignore the stares. Then he heard a voice behind him. "Yo, Carter." He turned. It was Jamal, one of the older boys. "That took guts, man." Elijah blinked. "What?" "Standing up to those cops," Jamal said. "Most of us would have just taken it." Elijah hesitated. "I didn't do anything. My dad did." Jamal smirked. "Yeah, but you didn't just let them walk over you either." For the first time since the incident, Elijah felt a small spark of pride. Officer Caldwell sat at home, staring at his untouched coffee. He knew he had messed up. Unlike Reed, he wasn't proud of what they had done. With a deep breath, he reached for his phone and dialed a number he never expected to call. "Chief Carter," he said when the line connected. "I need to talk." Chief Carter agreed to meet Caldwell at a diner on the edge of town. When he arrived, Caldwell already had a cup of coffee in front of him, his hands clasped together. "I owe you an apology," Caldwell said, looking him in the eye. "More importantly, I owe your son one." Chief Carter stayed silent, letting him continue. "I didn't stop Reed. I should have. And I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to make it right." Chief Carter studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Then start by telling the truth." That evening, Elijah sat with his father at the dinner table. "I don't want to be afraid every time I walk down the street," he said quietly. His father met his gaze. "Then we'll make sure you don't have to be." Elijah nodded, determination settling in. He wouldn't let this define him. A week later, Caldwell stood in front of the community at a town meeting. "I was wrong," he admitted, "and I'm sorry, Elijah." People murmured, surprised at his honesty. Reed, however, was nowhere to be seen. Unlike Caldwell, Reed refused to accept responsibility. He pushed back, arguing against his suspension. But when video footage of the encounter surfaced, the town turned against him. His career was over. With Reed gone and new policies in place, the police department began working on rebuilding trust. Elijah, still wary, knew things wouldn't change overnight, but it was a start. One evening, Elijah sat with Grandma Rose on the porch. "I'm proud of you, baby," she said, squeezing his hand. Elijah smiled. "I'm proud of Dad, too." She chuckled. "He's got fight in him, just like you." Months later, Elijah walked through Willow Street again. This time, he wasn't afraid. The world hadn't changed completely, but he had, and that was enough for now. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Conversations about justice, equality, and change are more important than ever. Here's how you can take action. Share this story to raise awareness. Speak up against injustice when you see it. Support organizations working toward police reform and racial equity. Educate yourself and others. Change starts with knowledge. Every voice matters. Every action counts. Together we can build a world where no one has to live in fear simply for being who they are. Join the movement for justice.